What's up, Carbon Collective? Zach Stein here, co-founder of Carbon Collective, and in this month's newsletter, what I want to talk about is this report that just dropped from one of our favorite think tanks, RethinkX. And what they go into and talk about in this report, which I will dig into and give our analysis on, is the fact that we are in the middle of a series of technology disruptions and how they are going to impact climate change. And basically what they argue is that the technology disruptions that we're in are not well captured in existing climate reports, and that they are very significant from the market forces alone of what they're changing. So let's dig in. To exactly what they mean. So this is the report. And what they argue is that 8 technologies, solar, wind, batteries, electric cars, autonomous cars, and then plant-based meats / fermentation-based meats and cell-based meats, financial and economic forces that are behind these technologies, the level of technological disruption that they are bringing to their respective industries, those alone will lead to a 90% emissions reductions by 2035 in kind of their middle scenario. And so that's without significant government intervention. This is just the government not doing stuff. And that the economic forces alone behind these will lead to significant changes in carbon footprint. And so let's start here. What they argue is that these technologies are in the early stages of disrupting the old technology that is here. And that when that happens, there's a very well-studied feedback loop, which goes on an S-curve, which is basically that you have a new technology, let's say the digital cameras, where they first come about. And you have, all right, some people are like, all right, this is really cool, but it's a lot more expensive and it's kind of clunky and there's like not great support for it. So just a few people use it. You kind of have these early adopters. But like a digital camera is better. You can see the picture immediately of what it is. You can save far more pictures. And because you don't have to go get your film developed and things like that. And so you could see that the potential that even in these early days, this was a much better technology than was a film-based camera. People really like film, but it's, switched and become the niche now. And so as you had more adoption for digital-based technologies, we entered this virtuous cycle where you had more margins, more revenues, more investment from them, which led to more supply, which led to lower costs, more public acceptance, and better capabilities of them, and more economies of scale and more variety. And so you kind of had this virtuous cycle of supply and demand that would lead up the curve, where at the same time you had the opposite happening in film cameras. You had less demand, so this is lower margins, lower investment. The shop at the mall that would process your film is starting to get way less business, to the point that maybe they need to go out of business. And so then when you're thinking about your next camera and you're like, but where do I get my film developed? There's the shop at the mall closed, you're probably like, all right, I guess I just have to go digital. And so that's where you have that transformation, as you have the kind of the death spiral here of the support happening. And what this leads to is that we as humans often think that kind of change happens linear, but that it doesn't. It happens for these types of things historically, and we have no reason to think that this will stop, that it happens on an exponential curve until it hits relatively full adoption. And then you have what's left is just niche. It's the people who like film cameras for, doing their own film development and stuff like that. But the vast majority of cameras are digital now. And so they put together a series of times when this has happened historically. And so we can see here this is the cameras one, from film to digital, a pretty complete, but we can see it in video, insulin from animal to recombinant, corn from non-GMO to GMO, for better or for worse, nails, coal, car tires, red fabric dyes. All of these things had a similar type of transformation when a newer technology that came about that maybe wasn't cheaper at first, but could see the long-term trajectory was far better. And so that is the scenario. This is the scenario that RethinkX argues that we're in, and that we're in these early stages for these key parts of solving climate change. So let's go to the first one. So the first one here is renewable energy. Basically, the cost of deploying solar and wind has dropped substantially over the past 10 years. And it is projected to continue going forward. And the same is true for battery technology, which is really key to storing that excess solar and wind power so that it can be used when it's dark or it's not windy. What we can see that's led to is, over the past 20 years, rather than a linear rise deployment, we've seen an exponential rise. And we see the same thing in their second category, transportation. With electric cars, they are better. They are safer. They are much cheaper to operate. An electric drivetrain can last up to 1 million miles. So this is especially true for cars that get driven a lot. Electric cars like police cars or ride shares or things like that, especially as charging gets more ubiquitous, it just makes a lot of sense to switch to electric cars. This is why Ford F-150, for their electric car, they are building it specifically for car fleets. So when contractors and stuff like send out their trucks, A, they can track them really easily, but B, it's actually a really good use of electric cars, like HVAC systems and companies and stuff like that. And then at the same time, batteries, which has really led this, the cost of developing or of producing a battery has dropped by 10x over the past 10 years. And we've seen at the same time, the capacity of those batteries has gone up considerably as well. And so given the fact that, yes, an electric car still costs more than a traditional car up front, just as a digital camera did cost more than a film-based camera up front, the writing is on the wall. Electric cars, they're better, they're faster, and they're going to be cheaper. Bloomberg estimates it's going to be by 2027. We could see it happen earlier than that. They're already cheaper to own and operate. So we're going to see that same exponential growth curve. And then the final category, this is super interesting, is food. What they argue is that we are in a similar level of exponential growth of cell-based meat and fermentation/plant-based meats taking over the animal agriculture industry. So this is the one that feels like the furthest from where we are today, but we are seeing it happen. It was only a few years ago where Beyond Burgers and Impossible were pretty hard to find. It was just kind of this very niche, rare food, whereas now they're a staple in many refrigerators and restaurants across America. And there are billions of dollars being poured into the next Impossibles and Beyonds that are going way further. Cell-based fish, a cell-based steak that is going to reach taste parity. Right now, Impossible and Beyond, they taste really good, but it's still not quite the same. But taste parity is coming, and especially when that point hits, what they estimate, and this is pretty crazy, is that this type of protein, the production will be 5 times cheaper by 2030 and 10 times cheaper by 2035. What that comes from is that these types of foods will be 100 times more land efficient, 10 to 25 times more feedstock efficient, 20 times more time efficient so that you can grow them way faster than like a cow, and 10 times more water efficient. So you can get meat for way less input into it, which makes sense why it would be way cheaper. So this is the one that we're the furthest out from, kind of the levels of fermentation technologies that they're talking about. We still don't quite have today, and particularly we don't have at scale. But the solution is really exciting. If this happens to the degree that they're projecting, and this is by 2040, it would be in 20 years, is that a landmass the size of the US, China, and Australia put together would no longer need to be used for animal agriculture. The majority of this is grazing, and then also animal feed cropland. That is nuts. That is an absolutely crazy large amount of land, and it's one of the big ways that they project for us meeting these scenarios, is that these lands will allow to passively be reforested. In that when these lands are allowed to lie fallow and recover, that they will begin becoming carbon sinks again, and life will regrow on them, and that excess carbon will allow to be sequestered in those soils again. And so this is a fascinating study, and this probably leads to the biggest criticism of this study, which is that a lot of it rests upon this assumption of what's going to happen in the animal space, and particularly what's going to happen with land use. Because if we go and look, that a very significant, almost 20%, of the reduction in emissions that they are projecting come from this passive reforestation. This is when farmland is allowed to lie fallow and permanently. And that seems like a pretty big stretch. This is land that people own. They are probably going to want to do something productive with it, even if the thing that's best for the planet is for it to lie fallow and reforest. So potentially this is combined with some type of offset scheme or something like that. It'd be interesting to dig deeper into their assumptions there. Some crazy stats here. that they call out, or kind of the ripple effects of what they see these changes will be. One is that we'll have a significant lower amount of raw steel demand. This is because a lot of previous things that are dependent upon fossil fuels we're going to stop using. So we're going to have a lot of like leftover boats and pipelines and cars, and steel is pretty much entirely recyclable, and so we'll be able to use that, and that's way more carbon efficient. This is also really nuts how it will change the shipping industry. So approximately 30% of all ship tonnage in the world is oil tankers. Well, about 40% consists of dry bulk cargo ships that carry coal, iron ore, cars, trucks, livestock, and grains. So we'd still see some of that 40% of cars are still going to be shipped, and iron is still going to be shipped, and livestock and grains, livestock in their argument to a much lower extent. But that's talking about 70% of shipping being significantly reduced. So I love this report, not because I agree with everything in it and that we agree with anything in it. I think that they make some assumptions that are plausible but seem pretty far out there at the moment. I think they make a lot of assumptions that seem very plausible right now and aren't that far out there at the moment. But on all fronts, what they do is they kind of flip climate change and how we think about it on its head, and instead say, let's take this viewpoint of, if we're just looking at the economics and we're just looking at historical trends of how technological shifts happen, where are we? And what's happening? And how does that just happen to relate to climate change? And that's really positive. Basically, fossil fuels across the board are on a path to being disrupted out. And that's not because of government intervention. It is because that the products that are replacing them are better. And if they're not cheaper already, they have the capacity to get far cheaper over the next 10 years than what they're replacing in fossil fuels. And so this is where they put it. And again, this is with that big caveat of what's happening with land use and the ability for it to draw down carbon. And so they put together 3 scenarios, where their Get Serious scenario, this is where the government takes steps to help fuel these transitions to go faster. And so they have us reaching zero carbon emissions by 2035 and actually going negative because of the passive reforestation that's happening. In the Be Sensible scenario, where basically the government does nothing, it's saying we're just not going to intervene here, the market forces are at work, they have us reaching pretty close to 0% carbon by 2040. And here in the Get Stuck scenario, they have us reaching 25% of the emissions of what we're emitting today by 2040. And in the Get Stuck, this is where the government intervenes on behalf of fossil fuel companies and of factory farming. And so I want to highlight this study as a counter to the narrative that we are doomed when it comes to climate change. This is by no means to say to stop. It's not like we are going to be okay, but that there are other trends that are going on here. If anything, what this type of study shows is that we actually can't imagine the world that's going to come in the next 20 years. Is it going to be one that is a hellscape that is driven by the exponential forces of compounding climate change? Or is it one where we're going to be seeing the path out that is driven by the exponential forces of technological disruption, which we're already seeing today? We're kind of seeing, and that's what's really interesting about this, is we're seeing these two forces come together, these two exponential curves. And so that's why we at Carbon Collective have built our sustainable investment portfolios around this type of methodology. We divest from the companies and industries that are dependent upon fossil fuels, the dying industry that it is, and give that share to the companies that are replacing them. The ones that are deploying solar, that are deploying wind, the ones that are decarbonizing our buildings, that are building electric car fleets and charging stations and green hydrogen, and the ones that are building the plant-based meats and those types of alternatives of the future. So that's all for this month. Check out this report. It will get you thinking at the very least, and we strongly applaud RethinkX for the way that they are pushing the envelope in how we think about climate change.